in 4 seconds.
Wow, we are already going. So welcome everybody to episode, hang on, don't say it. Episode 46?
Yes, wait.
Okay, of the Books and Brews podcast.
You might think from my math problem, I've already been drinking.
Yeah, I wasn't looking at your hands, I was looking at my folders on my computer to see what it was. I was
What number? Well, I was too, so.
So how's your last however long been?
Well, how was my month, you ask?
Cat wanted to say.
Hey, hello, cat. Barley, right?
Beautiful.
Barley.
What a beautiful cat.
He is a beautiful cat. He's the cutest cat on the planet.
He is adorable. Yeah. Well, here's what I've been reading this month. Have you ever heard of this book, Where Men Win Glory by John Krakauer?
No, I love John Krakauer, but I don't know that book.
Oh, really? Yeah, the name is familiar to me. I haven't read any of his other books. It's about Pat Tillman, if you remember him. He died in, I believe, 2004. He was a football star for the Cardinals, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Arizona.
My team.
What?
My team, the Cardinals.
Oh, is it? In Arizona?
Yeah.
Really? So do you know the name Pat Tillman?
I do.
Okay. Yeah. So he was, I believe, 24, 23 when 9/11 happened. And long story short, he decided that if other men were going to fight, potentially die, that he needed to serve his country too. And so first he turned down a $9 million contract from, I believe, St. Louis in order to stay with the Cardinals. But they were offering him something like $3 million. He turned that down to join the army as a private.
Wow.
And he did end up being killed in Afghanistan. I believe it was Afghanistan. So it's quite a poignant and powerful look at, let's just say, all the deceptions that are told to us, both by the government and the media, in the name of, supposedly for our own good.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very interesting story. And then Chris just bought this series. There's one more that I'm actually reading, but I can't find it. So it is that Minnesota Moxie, Minnesota Mayhem, and then there's Minnesota Mysteries. And so Ben Welter, I think he works at the Star Tribune, and he's gone through all their old copies of newspapers and pulled together all these fascinating stories that have been printed in the newspaper from the 1800s onward.
Wow.
So it's a really neat set of books.
Those sound pretty cool.
Yeah.
I obviously haven't been reading anything at all.
I didn't even ask this time. I figured if you had, you would say so.
So who's our guest today?
Jane writes romance with a twist under her own name. While under the name Eva Glyn, she writes escapist, relationship-driven fiction. She draws her inspiration from nuggets of history found at home and abroad. The Eva Glyn books are set in Croatia. And I just have to show you, if I can get this in front of the camera, in honor of your books, I wore my earrings that I got in Dubrovnik. So that's really, yeah. I was so excited when I saw we're going to have books set in Croatia and especially Dubrovnik because I've actually been there. And I went back and forth because at the time I went to Dubrovnik, I didn't necessarily have a lot of spare money, and $10 for a pair of earrings was like, oh, should I spend it? And I walked away. No, I don't need another pair of earrings. And then I walked back and I walked away and I finally bought them. So I'm thrilled just for today.
I got a good reason to wear them.
I just have to tell a crazy Dubrovnik story that I have. So when I went to Dubrovnik, it was still Yugoslavia at the time. But I had the craziest nightclub experience in Dubrovnik. So I had met this guy, he was a homeless young man on the street named Peace. That's what he told me. And he said my name was Peace too. So it was two
There it
guys
is.
named Peace wandering around Dubrovnik. And he suggested we go to a nightclub that night. So we went. And it was the strangest experience I have ever had in a nightclub. So usually here in a nightclub, you know, you often have the dance floor full of women and all these men kind of lingering around the edges.
Mhm.
There it was the opposite. You had all the men on the dance floor and the women lingering around the edges, but the men weren't dancing. They were playing really ferocious air guitar.
So I'm curious then, how would you answer that regarding the Civil War? You know, why are we so much more fascinated with the Civil War than with the Revolutionary War?
I really don't know. I mean,
Of course, you're in England, so.
well, I do know a little bit about the Civil War. We did a tour which basically followed Sherman's march through the South. So I possibly know, because my husband's really, really interested in Civil War history. So I possibly know a little bit more about it than most English people. For me, I think the fascination was that it was American fighting American. And within that, as an author, you can probably create all sorts of different tensions about what's going on, and families being divided, and groups of friends being divided, being on different sides. And you can create quite a lot of dramatic tension. I don't know if that's the reason.
You know, I think that's a really good point. And that's something I've never thought about, that you've got the family tension, you know, the tension of neighbor against neighbor. Whereas, you know, sorry to say this to someone from England, but for the Revolutionary War, it was kind of cut and dried, at least, you know, how we view it, literature. We're the good guys, you're the bad guys. There's not quite the dramatic story there. I think that you bring up a really good point.
Beer number 3 is another imperial stout. There are a couple reasons for this pairing. One, because this, although not as dark as the last reading, there's a lot of dark foreboding and fear of the past about this next reading. So this beer is called Dark to the Core Imperial Stout. But the main reason I picked it is because collaboration is very important in this last reading. Collaboration between brewers is a big thing in craft beer and has been for a long, long time. So brewers getting together to design beers and kind of learn from one another. So this Dark to the Core Imperial Stout is a collaboration beer between Abyss Brewing and, we got Abyss in there again, Abyss Brewing and Burning Sky Brewery. So I really wanted to get a collaboration beer in for this last reading. So again, I don't have this beer in front of me, nor do you, Laura. So
You're right.
cheers nonetheless.
Cheers nonetheless. I'm about to open my second one, and we'll see if that explodes. And
nearby was a low stone wall, and Jadran perched on it. What exactly have you come here to see? Fran shook her head, unable to look at him. It was a very good question. Wanting to see Daxa had been something her son Michael had suggested, but what she hoped to gain from being here, I don't know really. What an idiot she must seem. You have a personal connection to the island. It was a statement rather than a question. Adran might have said, my father was one of the men executed here, but please don't think badly of me because of it. Why would I do that? With genuine surprise in his voice. Discovering your father is most likely a Nazi sympathizer is not an easy thing, especially when you've been brought up to believe he died a hero. In my experience, men are not one things, they are many things, And you, Sir Franco, have not been shaped by your father. You must have been far too young when he died. At the use of her given name, she turned. No one's called me Sir Franco since I was a child, and only then when my mother was cross with me. Do you mind me using it? She thought for a moment. Actually, no, I don't. He nodded, then levered himself away from the wall. Well, if you do not know what you're looking for, then I suggest we find it. She followed him up the steps and into the building. Above them was a barrelled ceiling with stone lintels and traces of wooden joists where an upper floor had once been. The ground beneath their feet was damp in patches, and there was a musty air to the place, despite the breeze trickling in, stirring the dust. Jadron sneezed, and the sound echoed through the arches. This must have been part of the monastery, he said. A storeroom, perhaps. Fran looked up at the barred windows. Or a prison. Maybe for defence against pirates. All the same, Fran could not help but stare up at them. Had the floor been in place in 1944? Had her father gazed from those high windows across the treetops towards the mainland? No, it was too fanciful thinking these things about him. She couldn't even picture him, whether he was tall or short, dark or fair. Yet here his presence was all around her. Her eyes adjusting to the light, she noticed there was graffiti on the walls, and she bent to take a closer look. While some was clearly fairly recent, lower down were letters scratched roughly into the surface, initials or names and swastikas. Her stomach churned. These men had been fascists, all right, and it seemed in more recent years it had become a place of pilgrimage for those who believed the same. She closed her eyes. Jadron was behind her. So much for no one coming here, but then someone must have found the remains and alerted the archaeologists. Fran crouched down. Some of it seems older. She tried to stop her finger from trembling as she pointed. And look at the swastikas. She felt his heat as he dropped to his haunches next to her. Shall we see if we can find your father's name? I want to, and yet I don't. How could she explain to a stranger? Finding a swastika next to his initials would be the final, incontrovertible truth that her father had been a Nazi collaborator. And much as now she knew in her heart it was true, she wasn't ready to be faced with that just yet.
Sorry, you ended too soon.
You're busy with your beer.
I just can't get it right this time.